This is Think Out Loud on OPB. I'm Dave Miller. We start today with the latest on K-12 schools in Oregon. Some districts in East Multnomah County had been planning to stick with comprehensive distance learning until the end of the school year. Then, at the beginning of this month, Oregon Governor Kate Brown announced that all schools in the state have to offer in-person instruction by mid-April. So some districts have had to turn on a dime. OPB's K-12 education reporter Elizabeth Miller has been looking into this, and she joins us once again. Liz, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us the story of how one middle school principal in the David Douglas School District, Michael Contreras, heard about the return to in-person instruction?
Yeah, I asked him to kind of walk me through that day and how he found out. And of course, it first started out as a rumor, as a lot of things do. But eventually the message came down during a staff meeting. And he said staff had a lot of questions, but he couldn't really answer them. I mean, I think he said, I can read you the email because I'm looking at it just like you are. And then, from there was a staff meeting where he and the school's COVID committee took questions and kind of categorized them and tried to help get them answered for staff who had a lot of questions.
I mean, so it seems like at least some school officials found out about Governor Brown's order the same day, the same way everybody else did?
Yeah, that's how it sounded to me. And, from talking to folks that day, it seemed kind of like the case. But then when you think about all the people that work in schools and lead schools or districts, I can understand how, you might not be able to give everybody advance warning of something like that. And in a way, the announcement was advance warning for the executive order, which came down, I think, a week later.
Okay, so that's a sort of a fair way to think about it, a different way to think about it. Yeah. So what kinds of reactions did you hear from administrators specifically in East County schools?
Yeah, I think it's what I heard is the constant with all of this reopening, the tempered excitement, excited to welcome kids back, knowing that in-person or saying that in-person serves kids better than distance learning generally, but there's then the question of how do we do it and how do we do it safely? I thought Gresham Barlow Superintendent Patrice Pereira summed things up really well in a message that she shared with families in early March. She talked about how the district had tried to communicate all these changes to guidance and be responsive, but sometimes the changes just led to confusion and frustration for families and school communities. And I think that's kind of how folks are feeling about it.
That's Gresham Barlow. In the David Douglas District's case, as I mentioned, they had previously, their plan had been to stick with so-called comprehensive distance learning, meaning students, for the most part, all at home. They were going to stick with that through the end of the school year. What was their reasoning for that?
Yeah, so the district and the school board came to that decision back in February. They'd heard from surveys that a lot of families wanted to stay in distance learning, but there were some students and families that wanted to come back or needed that extra support. So David Douglas was going to start this limited in-person instruction, which we've seen in other districts as well. So David Douglas was set to start that after spring break. And so in kind of coming to that decision and sharing that message with families that they were going to stay in CDL, comprehensive distance learning, the board shared a couple of specific reasons. Families and staff will be safer in distance learning, and they were saying that students would receive more instruction time in distance learning than in a hybrid model, and that kind of trying to provide both a hybrid and a distance learning model would strain staffing.
Although that's exactly where we are right now, which we'll get to.
Right.
So what are the particular challenges for a district like David Douglas, which more than others? So we should mention again that some districts in the state have already been in in-person learning for months now, and others were in the process of switching to that when the governor made her order. And so a place like David Douglas is really in a kind of unique position. What are the particular challenges for a district like David Douglas?
I mean, I think it's really balancing the needs and expectations of the families at home and those that are showing up to school. And that takes a lot of planning, making sure schedules work out, making sure staffing works out. And then you get to numbers. And, David Douglas has the largest high school in the state. So when it comes to offering in-person instruction, that could bring extra challenges. And what David Douglas is dealing with is this tight timeline and not much time left to go in the school year. So I mean, elementary, I'd read, was maybe planning to return in hybrid, but that wasn't really the case for these other schools.
How much support have districts gotten from either the Oregon Health Authority or the Oregon Department of Education as they try to, race to open up?
So from what I've heard from district administrators, they have had support from the state and from the Oregon Department of Education. ODE actually surveyed every district after the governor's order to ask whether they felt ready and prepared for hybrid or fully on-site instruction. And then after receiving those responses, ODE staff followed up with some of those folks and showed up in staff or community meetings. Through that communication and with ODE support, some schools will be reopening later than the governor's timeline, including Gresham Barlow and Reynolds. The other part of support that I wanted to touch on was the support from the Multnomah Education Service District. And this is a organization that works with all the districts in Multnomah County and kind of shares between districts what works and what doesn't. And I think that's helpful for the East Multnomah districts because they aren't the first to go back in person. And so many schools have been where they've been. Then there's also the informal support. Principal Contreras mentioned talking to the folks at Estacada Middle School, who's had in-person learning for a while now. So there's all kinds of support, I think, happening behind the scenes.
If you're just tuning in, we're talking right now with OPB K-12 education reporter Elizabeth Miller about specifically the return to some version of in-person instruction in a handful of East Multnomah County school districts. Can you give us a sense for the actual hybrid models that these districts have come up with?
For the elementary students, it seems to one of the consistent things that I'm seeing is, in person for a couple of hours, a couple of times a week, either like a Monday, Tuesday or a Thursday, Friday, and then having a day with distance learning or a day where there's professional development for staff or planning for staff, things like that.
How different is that from, places like what Portland Public Schools are offering?
It doesn't seem that different, but I mean, some of these schools are offering 2 days a week in person for elementary schools. And for Portland Public Schools, that's 4 days. So the big similarity with all of these districts in the Portland area is that there will still be a portion of the week in distance learning. I haven't seen any Portland area districts that's having students back full time yet. And that's something that some families are asking for.
As we've talked about before, the governor's mandate is that schools have to offer some form of in-person instruction now, but the mandate is not that students have to go and have to opt for it. Do these districts have a sense for how many students or how many of their families will actually be opting for this hybrid option?
That was one of my big questions in reporting out this story. And some of these districts have had surveys, and they say that there's a slight majority of folks that are interested in hybrid, but there's still a lot of unknowns. Centennial, for example, had asked families at the beginning of the school year what they wanted to do. But of course, they want to ask again because so much has happened since the beginning of the school year. And that's something that I think a lot of districts a lot of these East County districts are trying to figure out, like, who is coming back and how can we serve them and the people at home.
You found a letter from the superintendent of the Park Rose district talking about the preferences that they're hearing from families for both hybrid options and sticking with some version of distance learning. The superintendent wrote that, quote, "It makes it very challenging to provide a high quality experience for all students with our current staffing levels." What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that concern that the David Douglas folks had about, is this going to be less instruction time for students? Is this going to strain our staffing levels? And I think we're going to see that. I mean, I think you kind of alluded to that. So in some cases, it does leave students with less instructional time to be switching to this hybrid model. There's the whole question of students being able to keep their teachers in a hybrid model versus a distance learning model. And of course, this all differs depending on the district. And then something we've talked about before, this simultaneous instruction to students in person and online, is something that districts are still figuring out, and whether that might help teachers and students stay together or help this high quality experience. I don't know. But what I'm trying to say is that districts are deciding whether this simultaneous instruction might help or might be something that they don't want to do when it comes to hybrid.
How do negotiations between districts and teachers unions play into all of this?
I'm not sure where things stand for all of the districts in East County, but I know for the Reynolds School District, there were a couple of things still being figured out when I was working on this story. The teachers union there and the district were still working on how to address air quality and ventilation concerns. And that's something we've heard all over the area, including in Portland Public Schools. But the teachers union there and the district came to an agreement that they both agreed with.
And finally, what kinds of mental health supports might be in place for students as they return to school buildings?
I think students will see teachers and staff that have been offered training to help support students when they're returning. Some schools are offering time for social emotional learning in that in-person day, but I'm sure there's a bunch of other direct supports that students might see as well that I haven't heard about yet.
Liz, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Dave.
Elizabeth Miller is OPB's K-12 education reporter.